gosh. Well, I'm glad we're having a little chuckle
I
because
am too.
I know this episode might be a little on the heavier side, maybe.
Yeah, well, you know what? I was trying to figure out how I would feel, and then I realized I don't know how I'm going to feel at the end of this hour because we have no control over things that we don't know about yet. So, with that being said, I was saying my good friend, no, my acquaintance, I'd like to say, is our guest today, and our guest is by the name of Keith Morgan. And Keith Morgan is an author, and a lot of Keith's publications and projects result around childhood Holocaust survivors, and specifically within Lithuania. And we can ask about other parts of Europe as well and the world. But the reason why I say and spot out Lithuania is because my grandmother, my late grandmother, Ruth Kron Sigal, she was born in Lithuania in Shavl, which is a small region around the Baltic Sea. So her background, as we talked a little bit about both Rachel and myself, about our grandparents and how our ancestry is, I thought it would be really great after having our episode with Jeannie Becker and Dr. Rachel Yehuda about intergenerational trauma to have Keith come on the show, as I've only met him once in person when this had been finished, which is basically the book Ruta's Closet, which is the story about my grandmother's life from childhood to late age, but also talking about other other lives and just general culture of Lithuanians in the Holocaust, and then the people that were responsible behind it and that were part of the survival and the rescuing of my ancestry and others. I would guess I haven't read it obviously, but I've had it, and it's really special because when it was there and my grandmother helped to write it before she passed away, it has a note in there.
Oh my gosh.
So this is like a first edition. It's getting a second edition, and it's coming out with some other developments, which is really neat, which I want Keith to talk about.
Now, how come you say you haven't read it obviously because you don't like to read?
Well, I don't like to read, but also,
Ask that question.
well, no, because anyone listening to this might be like, well, why wouldn't you read it? It's your grandmother's story. No, because I'm pretty, it's pretty traumatic to understand my history and my past. So I've heard lots of it, and my grandmother did a great job at archiving and going back to Lithuania 4 times, and literally like getting on video, which we have somewhere. It's not lost. But she went back and got her archives to kind of do her own autobiography,
Right.
which is incredible. And so my grandmother was also the director of the Women's Resources Group
I in
for the, yeah, in Vancouver. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So that was extremely pivotal for so many people in that industry, in that community. And my grandmother also helped a lot with the Jewish Family Services Association. With that being said, too, especially in the later years of her life before she passed away,
Yes.
my relationship with my grandmother was very heated, I would say. I loved her a lot, but she would always, with anyone in her family, would always get to the bottom of things and just say, like, if she had an agenda for something, she went and had her agenda done, basically. So whenever it came to wanting to get to know you or know what's in your life, she would always push your buttons, be like, okay, what's going on? Why are you doing this? Whatever. And I was kind of the same way, I realized, which is why there was a lot of hostility that I felt toward her. And then realizing, holy crap, I'm my grandmother's grandson. So no wonder I feel so much resistance. And I didn't really spend as much time with her as I maybe wanted to, now that I reflect back on it. But
Mhm.
I understand why it was hard for me, because there were so much similarities in her personality, right?
Interesting.
Um, yeah. So, I mean, there's so many memories I have of her, but what I remember the most about her is that she's strong, fearless, frenetic, neurotic, extremely anxious. And absolutely resilient and perseverant and tenacious, and didn't let anything stop her, including her anxiety and her mental health, from being successful in what she wanted to do, including after immigrating to Canada from Munich, which I did not know that my ancestors were in Munich after the Holocaust for a little bit,
Oh,
then through Nova Scotia, and then across eventually to Vancouver, where
okay.
then my mom was born, my aunt was born, my uncle was born, and then that started around there in the late 50s, mid to late 50s. It
Wow.
was really fascinating to kind of read to this backgrounder that Keith sent both of us, because at first when Keith sent it, I was trying to read it and I read one page and I was just like, this is too much. I can't read this. And this is not even the book. This is just a backgrounder about like some of the ancestry of where my family came from. And then yesterday I just said, okay, you have to read this. See, if you can't read the book right now, you've got to read this backgrounder. So when I read that, I even found stuff out that I didn't even know about, including how my family eventually immigrated to Vancouver, like where they settled there. I thought there was less steps between.
So Keith must have known your grandmother very intimately.
He knew her intimately for sure. And they actually, when in the backgrounder, it says that Keith and my grandmother met through a Holocaust speaker series or something like that. And
Okay.
it stemmed from that talk, that project of series or whatever, 4 talks or 4 series. Keith can fill us in. It was a lot to read in the backgrounder, but
Yes.
that's how the whole conversation began. In addition to that, my great grandfather, Meyer, who my late brother's middle name was Meyer, that's who he was named in honor of.
Oh wow.
Meyer also wrote an unpublished publication about his story, his memoirs called Through the Eye of the Needle. So
Yes, you told me that. Yeah.
so I have, my mom has a copy of that. And so if I read this correctly, it seems like Ruta's Closet has elements of that in this book, combining it with my grandmother's story as well. So that I also wasn't aware of, and I think I interpreted that correctly from his backgrounder.
Well, and I'm really curious to know, because so he's actually from England originally.
Yeah, from Liverpool, I believe.
Blackpool.
Blackpool, sorry, it was some pool.
Some pool. And he I always want to get these things right. I wasn't sure. Journalist. He calls himself a journalist reporter for the Vancouver Sun in Vancouver for not a long time, actually, and province. So, and he did that for a very long time. So I'm curious to know, like, when his perspective, or when it sounds like this was like a real passion project for him.
Mm-hmm.
And I really want to know how, like, what intrigued him to dive so deeply, because no, like, is he Jewish? Like, I look at his name. I know this sounds horrible, but like, I don't think he is, but maybe he is.
I don't think he is, but I actually can't confirm that. So luckily, he'll be on any moment. We can clarify that.
Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
I just find that very interesting as well. And, you know, what you said about your grandmother and her resilience, but also her, you know, just like says it like it is, like,
Mm-hmm.
will tell you to your face, like, like, why aren't you doing this? Or why aren't you doing that? Or my grandfather was the same way.
Mm-hmm.
The same way. He would tell strangers things on the street, like, like things that they didn't ask him
Mm-hmm.
in, or his opinion on things. He would just, like, I wonder, yeah, that's an interesting trait from.
Mm-hmm. It is.
I mean, I know everybody is different, but it's very interesting that you say that, because he was very similar in that respect.
You know, I think any ancestry that's gone through some form of genocide or, yeah, you know, I'm going to call it apocalypse. Any generation that's gone through that kind of stuff, Inquisition, that's going to happen.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that background. I love it.
That's a fantastic background. Hey, Keith, how are you?
I'm very well. It seemed appropriate to have that.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, I flashed the copy that you provided me way back.
Oh my goodness! Yes.
So I have that, but it can't really. Well, it could sit on my shoulder, I guess. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on to our podcast. I thought it would be really fitting to have you and to learn about how you've been and how you got to where you are and how things are going with your current project, with the story and the publication. We are recording at the moment, and I did give you a bit of an introduction, but we always like our guests to introduce themselves, both about what they're doing and anything else they want to share, just so that way we cover all the bases. So if you would like to introduce yourself and cover that, you're more than welcome to.
And it's nice
I'll try to be humble. As you probably gather, I hail from the north of England. Way back in the 50s, that's not the 1850s, the 1950s. Grew up there in Blackpool, a seaside resort, noted for fresh air and fun, as they used to say. I was in the rock music business when I left school for a while, worked with Judas Priest, for goodness sake. Yes, I'm sure your parents might remember that.
My husband would freak out. My husband's a huge Judas Priest fan.
Oh, there you go. We'll talk another time about that. But then I left them and went to work for the Evening Gazette in Blackpool. Worked there for a few years as a reporter, cub reporter as they called us at the time. And then I came to Vancouver and joined the province newspaper. Covered the crime beat for quite a long time. They seem to think that all Brit reporters are crime hounds. It's probably true. And so I did that, did all kinds of stuff. And eventually I got into writing a column about people who make a difference at home and overseas. And guess who was one of my first stories? It was Ruth. And it came, like so many things, it came in by sheer chance. It was a friend of the family who said, "Oh, you ought to talk to Ruth Sigal. She's talking to young people about her survivor experience." And then Rachel, my daughter, I always call her my favorite daughter, she jumped in and said, "Dad, I remember a speech, a talk from her. She's really good." That was back in, my goodness, when was it? 1990s. So, yeah. And we got together, and you know what? The first instinct as a newspaper guy was, wow, this is one heck of a story. And and that was it initially. And I got to thinking about it. Wrote the story, got great response, and then I just thought more and more about it. Then one Sunday morning, I woke up maybe a year and a half later and said, "You know what? This is such a great story with a great message." There's lots. We all know there's lots of survivor stories, and they're good, and everyone has a good story to tell. But this was exceptional from a news point of view, right? It was a human point of view. It was really interesting and had a great message. And it was about an obscure part of Europe, the Baltics, that very few people knew about. And so I went to my boss and I said, "You know, we can do more with this." So we collaborated with the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. We produced a 4-part cliffhanger kind of feature series called Hidden from the Holocaust. And then we featured all kinds of parallel stories that were going on at the same time. So, and it was primarily aimed at high school students. Yeah. And my bosses were really thrilled when they sold an extra 25,000 papers.
Yeah, of course.
You know, and so that wasn't the end of it. And Ruth told me, "This is not the end." And I said, "Wow, okay." And so it went from there. And then again, you know, I had a little time passed, and I thought, I need to really tell this story in book form. Because I believe it has resonance, and there's so many messages for today. You know, and of course, as you probably realize or remember, Ruth was talking not just about her experience, but relating it to genocides around the world now. Mm-hmm. And she was, and she told me she woke up in her 50s and decided it was time to tell a story. And so that was it. And so that was it. Put my head around the editor's door and said, hey, guess what? Ruth's is reuniting with her rescuer in Lithuania. And he just looked at me and said, this is Michael Cook. And he said, why haven't you booked the tickets? And that was it. And so began a great adventure, production of the book. And one of the last things that Ruth said to me was, well, Keith, you know everything about me, but you don't know my shoe size, and you never will. Great sense of humor, as you well know. We got on like a house on fire. And as she was sick, when she got sick, I promised her that it didn't end here, that it would proceed, and that I would use every opportunity I could to tell this story and expand it. And here comes the podcast, and that's where we are now. You're up to date.
Wow.
Unbelievable. And to be frank, I don't even know my grandmother's shoe size, so there you go. I don't have any privileged information to you, I gotta say. All I knew that she always wore the same pearl white pumps, had about 100 pairs in her closet, and whenever she got a new pair, it was the same thing. That's the only thing I can tell you that I do remember. It was always the same. Walk in, it was like a library ballet slippers, but they were pumps and they were white. That's all I remember. Thank you so much for that introduction and for clarifying some of that information. I feel very privileged and humbled that you were so quick to respond to me reaching out to you, and to know that her story is being shared, and that me and with the support of Rachel can continue sharing that and helping to support the spread of that story beyond what this capacity might be right now.
Yes. Well, and then, just what you said, Keith, about, I guess, what Ruth was saying before she passed on about, bringing the story to the modern times, that's still going through all these types of genocides and things around the world. And as the years go on, and not only that, but the racism and all the, we can swear on this podcast. I was gonna say the shit that's been even happening.
Don't forget, I'll be spreading this among less liberal people.
I didn't know that. I appreciate that. I will not swear again. But it kind of, the SHIT that's been going on in the past, year, well, especially brought to light with Mr. TRUMP and all the stuff that's been happening in the States, and just like there's always a good time to share these types of stories. But if there was a time to really bring these things to light again and to teach these lessons, and to, it's now.
Yes, and that's much of my personal motivation. I'm a student of history, not in the academic sense, but I am fascinated by that era because growing up in Britain, pretty good liberal education. We learnt about concentration camps, perhaps, enough to pique our interest as to, well, why was this happening? Yeah. And we were encouraged to discuss. And, as the years went by and I got older, I realized it was just as relevant today. And when I was doing the research for Ruta's Closet, I just came across so many examples that were current. Even when we were finishing the book, the graveyards, Jewish graveyards in Shavl, or Shavl as it's called in Lithuanian, were being, painted with Nazi symbols. And this is, recently. And we've seen what's been going on in Lithuania, in this country that's a beautiful country. Been there a few times now, but on the edge of every town, or it seems that way, there are mass graves, and that's where the Jews are. Yeah. They were shot, many of them by neighbors. And, when I was doing the first round of interviews in Lithuania, I always felt it wasn't that far from the surface. I was discouraged, or somebody would say, well, kind of brought it on themselves, that sort of thing, but done in such a matter of fact way, And I remember, of my association with the late, great Sir Martin Gilbert, who was my mentor in this. And, he told me the same thing. He'd been out there probably a year or so before me. And, he was out in villages. And he said, you talk to a farmer and you get onto the conversation and gradually it comes up. And, there's a lot of denial. I remember when I first interviewed Ona Ragauskas, who was the Ruth's rescuer. It was not that, they'd been liberated a while the last time, right, from the Russians, Lithuania. But she was still nervous about talking about it because neighbors had parents who had been naughty, to say the least. And that's the way she would say it at first, bless her, and she was quite reserved. But when I went back a few years later on my own to do further interviews and in-depth interviews with Anna and many others, she felt more free to talk. But then I thought, well, this is really encouraging. And now I'm still seeing the same kind of denial and this double narrative, this twin narrative, they work with the Russians it's terrible. And there's a reluctance to admit it. I think that was really, really highlighted for me over the last few years when you see this succession of fascist Lithuanian Action Front people who are being commended for their services to Lithuania, in that case, fighting Russians, but boy, did it come home to me quite recently when I came across a woman in Chicago called Sylvia Foti. And she was, I've spoken to a little bit, but I'm going to be interviewing her for the podcast, obviously. Yeah. And she was doing, ostensibly seemed to be doing kind of a family biography and taking it over from, I think, her mother. Forgive me if I've got that slightly wrong, but that was the idea. And she suddenly realized this man who had been her grandfather, who'd been commended for being this Lithuanian hero, when she started digging into it, she found out that he was a mass murderer of Jews. And of even more interest to me, of course, is guess where he was based? In Shavl.
Wow.
And, so I am going to be talking to her, obviously, but it was a great, can you imagine the shock of doing this lovely biography of one of your hero grandparents, only to find out it was a mass murderer? But good on her. She has written a fantastic book, and it's I think it's out now, and she doesn't hold back. Yeah, it doesn't hold back at all. So I'm really looking forward to talking to her for an interview like this, because we'll really get to learn about what she went through. I mean, I can't imagine. Even some of her family were naturally warning her off in the end, but she went through with it. So, I mean, those kind of things just reinforce the fact that this story needs to be told. I think, am I going on too long here?
Not at all. No, please.
I think one of the things, I think that struck me about this story and will go with me for the rest of my life. I mean, I'm not plot spoiling here because we know what happened. And that is that in the Kinder action, which happened in a number of ghettos, where basically the Nazis went in and removed all the children, and they took them to Auschwitz. And the story is that they came into the Shavl ghetto. Meyer and Gita Kron, parents, obviously, of Ruth, they kind of knew something like this was going to happen, so they arranged for her to be hidden by Grandpa, and that happened and was successful for a while. But then they came out too early of hiding and were found, and they were thrown on the back of a truck. And this was the bit that really got me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There was a scene, which I've got witnesses to, where second cousin Wolf Pisahowicz, who was the ghetto doctor, was arguing with the commandant, saying, "You can't do this. You owe me." Maybe you'll have to read the book to find out why he owed him. But he won. And in the end, he turned around and said, "Well, the older one can stay because she can work." Really? 6 or 7? But the young one has to go. And that was little sister Tamara. And this is what got me, was the scene of Ruth shouting at Tamara for leaving her on the back of the truck, getting a ride in a big truck. And little Tamara with her arms, basically shouting at her sister, "Don't let me go, don't let me go." And the rest is history, and that is Tamara went to Auschwitz and was gassed and killed. Ruth was saved, and to tell the story, of course. Okay. That single moment, how can you not relate to that? Whether you have children or not, brothers or sisters, that for me, that was what made it happen for me, and made it, no, I got to do this. Jesus, it's become my life's work.
I'm kind of speechless, and I'm also going through, because Hiiro, I can't even, I have no words. My grandpa,
I can talk, isn't it?
Well, yeah. My grandparents are also Holocaust survivors, and they were older, so they were like, they could work. They were teenagers, and anyway, I'm not going to tell the whole. There's a lot of stories there, but there's just, I guess you don't really realize sometimes how deeply ingrained it is, even in your DNA. Mm-hmm. Like, that didn't happen to me, personally or firsthand, but there's something so, like, in my blood that just not relates, but just, anyway, yeah, it's a lot.
One of the things that maybe in my later years that I will ponder more, I mean, I don't say I haven't pondered it now, but I'll ponder it more at more length, is during the course of this process of me working on this book, I met some absolutely incredible people. And it was amazing how one would open a door to another, and then another. And you can't help but think, meant to be, this was meant to be.
Yeah. And
I remember, you might not know this, Hiiro, but one of your grandmother's firm friends was Robert Krell, who's, done a lot at Vancouver Holocaust Center and many other things academically. And I was interviewing Robert, and he said, you should go and meet my friend Martin Gilbert. Well, I immediately know this is Churchill's biographer. Why is he going to want to speak to me? He's a sir, he's a knight, an English schoolboy. And so, I said, well, okay, if he'll see me. And he said, oh, he'll see you. And I wrote to him, and sure enough, he said, oh yeah, come along, gave me his private address. I went there. Well, I didn't realize at the time that Sir Martin actually knew Ruth's story. He'd been over here doing lectures, fundraising lectures, for various charities. And so he knew. And then through Robert, of course, he knew the story. And he turned to me and he said, Keith, you're a newspaper guy. You know how to write stories for people who are not Jews, who are going to need to know this. And he said, I'm a fusty old historian, He said, I write about this. This is the man that's got, I don't know how many books translated on the Holocaust, But anyway, he said, I'm just a fusty old academic. But he said, you have to tell this story. So yeah, I got a 2-line whip here. I've got Ruth telling me I have to, and I got Sir Martin Gilbert telling me I have to do. So you obey, right? So and he said, you got to bring this out. You've got to tell the story the way you tell your stories to your readers. You've got to show empathy. You've got to show it to them. And so he opened so many doors. I wanted to go see somebody, and then as soon as he picked up the phone, I was there. And at the same time, I'd found a guy on some website who had written some responses to the Kinder action, what was happening there. And he was a genealogist, and he was based in London, a guy called Dr. Saul Ishroff. And I thought, I should get hold of him. So I sent him an email 2 years later. Hey, are you still interested in this? He wrote. I found this in my junk folder. Well, so I said, oh, yes, I am, and told him I'd already seen some Martin and some other people. And so I was over there again, and now we've become lifelong friends. He and another person co-authored a 7-volume set on all that happened to the Jews in Lithuania, tracing from Wolverhampton. There were 200,000+ before the war. By the end of the war, 96% of them had been murdered.
Oh my God.
And Saul set about with this co-author of tracking down, because what the Nazis did was they used to, we'll always hear about their efficiency. They went into a ghetto or to a community before they turned it into a ghetto, and they did basically did a census of every single person, age, what they did. So all scattered around are these volumes of records of everybody that lived there. And that's how he was able to trace, really what happened to them. And so Saul has been incredibly helpful, is to this day. He's from South Africa, and he has a lot to do with educational places, and through his genealogy interest, he gets around the world, or not at the moment, none of us do, but he's just been remarkable for me, and tells wonderful stories himself, of course. And then, I'd go somewhere, and then somebody else would refer me to somebody else. And I remember once the story about Ruth was rescued by a couple who was supposed to rescue somebody else.
Oh,
a little girl, oh yeah. And an honor had come to pick this little girl up to take her, but then get ghetto gates. They had a way of getting her out without being, suspicion. Yeah. And the mother came and said, we just like to keep her for one last Shabbat.
That did it.
I did it. They kept her too long. And so those people worked in the factory that Maya Kron, was the chief engineer. And they came, knocked on his door and said, your daughter can be saved. I was about that for selflessness. And so that's how that happened. And years later, of course, I'm doing the research. Well, I knew the names of this couple. And I then found out that a woman I'd met in London who'd been quite helpful, she'd responded to an ad I'd put in the paper about looking for Shavl survivors. And she said, oh, I know them. They were friends of my parents from Shavl. And they now lived in France. But they've died. But you know what? They have a daughter in Israel, but she couldn't tell me where she was. Well, I have a friend here who's got a sister in Israel. And I said, I wonder if she could help me. Phoned her up, her sister, and she says, oh, yeah, she's my dentist.
Of course. Of course.
Gosh.
It's unbelievable. So,
and,
wow.
And that just keeps happening. And then it was like one day my phone rang at some ungodly hour on the West Coast, right? I thought, oh, yeah, this is a call from back east, must be. Sure enough, guy gets on the phone, he says, my name's Gene Luntz. I'm thinking straight away, I think I know that name. And he said, hey, I was just doing some research and I came across your name writing a book about this. And I said, yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, my father, and I immediately knew this was his original name was Lunsus. And his father was a ghetto gynecologist who had conspired with Wolf Pesahowitz to save unborn children who were threatened when there was a ban on births. And he said, I may have some things of interest to you, you know. And now this was a funny call because he said he realized I was from. Now this is another rock story here. So he said, "You're not from here, are you?" I said, "No, I'm from the north of England." And he said, "Oh, have you always been in music?" "No, I was in the music business." "Oh, one of my friends is. I just had Christmas with him, and he's in the music business." And he said, "I'm going to say you're from somewhere like Blackpool." And I'm thinking, how does a New Yorker know what a Blackpool guy talks like?
Yeah.
And he said, "Yeah, well, my friend's from Blackpool." And I said, "Oh, really?" He said, "You might know him." I said, "Well, I doubt it. You know, music business, Blackpool's big music business. I was beyond there anyway." And he says, "His name's Graham Nash. The Hollies, Crosby, Stills and Nash." "Oh, yeah, I do know. I actually have every album he's ever done." And it turns out he's an artist agent in photography, and because Graham Nash is now a photographer. And so he furnished me with these great material and told me the story about how his parents were separated when they liquidated the ghetto, and how basically they thought each other was dead. And he went to, I think it was to Vienna, that's right, and started to practice again. And he was dating a young lady. I don't think he was actually, I recall they were thinking of marriage, and he's walking down the street, and who's on the other side of the street? His wife. So they reunite.
Oh my gosh.
And remarkable stuff, and the reason why Gene had looked for me was because he'd come across my name. I think it was a guy in New Jersey called Ben Gotts, and Ben had done a family thing, saying, "Oh, my family does this. I've just met a guy from Vancouver doing this, blah blah blah," and of course Ben Gotts is a man I found who was the last baby born illegally in the ghetto. And I found him in New Jersey.
What?
Last count, he had 6 grandchildren.
Wow.
Probably more, who knows? So wow. Yeah, he was basically smuggled out. He was born in one room. His mother said, I'm not giving up my baby." He was born and he was smuggled out. Mm-hmm. And he lived in Lithuania for many years, and then was given the Kremlin let him go. Khrushchev actually let him return to his parents in New York. And then as I said, I met him, lovely man. And I will obviously be talking to him on the podcast. Yeah. But you see all the links. It's just remarkable.
It's completely remarkable. And myself and Rachel are just so humbled and grateful that you can share and articulate yourself in such an eloquent and succinct way. I mean, there's many things you've shared even in that passage of speaking that I was not aware of course, and that I'm grateful to now be aware of. What I'm wondering as well, though, is that in terms of the relationship you had with Ruth and how that developed, how that evolved, and especially in the later years of her life, and then how she did,
This started out as a 2-year project. Let's say, when would that be? That would be, sort of around 2000 or a little bit beyond then. And it's just, what I did was, Maya, your great grandfather, he had an amazing unpublished memoir.
Yes, that's right.
And which is available, I think, on digitally through the Eye of a Needle. I think you said Montreal has the university there, and so I used that as an outline to send me off to explore and expand and develop, and indeed get witnesses. It wasn't that I didn't believe him, but it's so much stronger if you can verify everything with somebody else and said, "Oh yeah, that happened this way."
Yeah.
So the old crime beat guy came back to the fore, and there I went investigating away. Oh, and this was just when Google was starting.
Oh, wow.
Oh yeah. Now what do you do?
Yeah.
So I used that to some degree, but I did. I mean, I used that as the outline, and every time I come back to report to Ruth, I say, I found something else out, and then of course she'd say, "Oh yeah, I remember that guy," and I'm saying, "Ruth, why didn't you tell me last week?"
Yeah.
But it was funny, and we just became good friends, and we went on. And of course, time passed, and the more and more it just kept expanding. And I kept saying to her, let's see this through to its logical end. Let me follow up every lead that I have, and let's put flesh on the bone. Because the better we do this, the better job we do it, the more it's going to be read and appreciated. And we arrived at this agreement that what we would do is, yes, it's a documentary, and yes, it's true, but we decided that to make it more accessible, wherever possible, we try to feed in conversations.
Yeah.
And she would vet them and say, yeah, and that's what my father would say. But of course, because he'd written that memoir, I already had a lot of his words. And so that wasn't that difficult. So we recreated stuff, and it's not made up, but it just helps it along. And of course, that was what I did when I went to see other survivors. I asked them to tell me, relate conversations. I mean, they weren't going to be verbatim, but they were going to be, the essence was going to be there. And the Judenrat, the Jewish council within the ghetto, had a scribe called Yerushalmi. And he kept meticulous notes, including quotes of what was being said in his minutes. Before the ghetto was liquidated, he hid his diary somewhere, and the Russians found it when they came back in again, and they used it in Nazi trials, and it was published in the Yad Vashem, the museum in Jerusalem.
Yeah,
they published it years ago. They kept coming across references to it online via Mr. Google, as we called him then, and I couldn't find. Well, of course, Saul. By that time, I got to know Saul, and he said, "Oh, well, try this, try that." Well, you know what? I did a search. I was feeling quite good, and one of the things that you taught to do as an investigator when you're covering police beat is just keep going. Right, go to the 7th page. So I did the same thing with Google. And I got to the 7th page of a search and was almost yawning by the time I'd gone through all the... Oh, isn't that coincidence?
That was subliminal.
Yeah. Whoa, this is scary. And so guess what? I found a bookstore, an antiquarian bookstore in Amsterdam that had a rebound copy of it.
No way.
So I ordered it and it arrived. Well, of course, it was all in Yiddish. It's not, I know the swear words. That's about it.
Yeah, totally.
And so I took it to the Vancouver Holocaust Center, and he said, "Oh, we have a team of translators. They meet every Monday or Tuesday."
Whoa.
Well, there was no index, but I knew roughly from Meyer's memoir pretty much the times. So I'd go and it was labeled in that way. It would say, March something to, So I would say, "Can you go in there?" And I'm looking for this.
Yeah.
Well, this little group came back with amazing material, all translated for me, plus all this verbatim stuff. And there was this amazing debate when the Nazis came in and said, "No more children born after this date. If they are, they'll be executed, and their entire families."
Oh my God.
And you can imagine the debate, the level of debate within the Judenrat. Because what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was so explosive. So, you know, the newspaper guy came to the fore again thinking, wow, you know, this is powerful. And, you know, in the end, Wolf was cooking up a little plan.
Yeah.
So he and Lunsus, they planned to basically tell these parents, or parents to be, I should say, you know, your children are going to be aborted before they're born. But guess what? We can induce some of them before that date. And they did.
Wow.
But again, one of those moments, I had this story from Pesahowitz about him carrying out the abortions.
Yes.
Can you imagine?
No, not even close.
And
Jesus.
he goes through the day and explains how they do it with these rudimentary tools, let's be honest, you know. And I mean, not in too gory detail, but he does. And then he turned to his nurse, who was his cousin, married, well, no, hang on, it was his sister-in-law, right, married to his brother. And she hopped on the table and had her abortion.
No.
I mean, whoa, again, you know. And I'm thinking, you know, people have got to see this. These are the stories of courage and bravery, you know, that they have to know. You know, people have to see this happened, you know. Stop denying this stuff. It happened.
Yeah, exactly.
The more
and you know, this, you know, so I created the book in that way. I explain it in the foreword, you know, why we did it this way, and we took some liberties with Lithuanian language because, of course, and you probably know their surnames different depending whether you're the daughter. We'll just stick with one name. We'll stick with Jewish names when we could.
Sure.
But we told it. I mean, in a nutshell, which I find hard to do, as you've gathered, it's a story of courage. It's a story that focuses on one family, but basically tries to tell the wider story of the ghetto in Shavl, then the much wider story, the Holocaust story.
Mm-hmm.
And I draw upon every resource I can to do that. And, you know, when I was first starting as a reporter, it's about people.
Yeah.
And you tell their stories. And they're so much more powerful than just a mere statement of facts. Mm-hmm. And that's what I endeavored to do. And I was fortunate in that the people of Ruth's family were so important within the ghetto. I don't mean that they thought themselves important. It's because they played such significant roles in the operation of the ghetto. You know, her father was pretty much running the leather factory, which was providing the goods for the boots, etc., the belts for the Germans on the Eastern Front in Russia. You know, you have the doctor there, who was the chief doctor in there, and, you know, doing unbelievable things. I mean, if there was a regret I have, is that I came into this too late to interview Wolf, who's got to be a buck on his own. I mean, it just the bravery and the conflict, you know, saving lives, right? But then being in a situation where he has to carry out abortions. You know, I mean, what was the alternative?
Oh, exactly.
You know, the genius, you know, and I'm told there is another incident later on where you kind of left guessing as to what happened. And it's when the liquidation happened. And I think it was two sisters came in. They had a member of the family in the little hospital, and they wanted him to kill her by lethal injection, because they'd learned that what was happening is when they left the ghettos, the Nazis were burning down the hospitals, destroying them, whatever, or just killing everybody that was left. And he's saying, you know, like, that's not what I do, you know. And I think there were half a dozen or more, maybe 12 left in the hospital on the day of liquidation. And his brother came in and said, "You got to leave now. We're all marching now."
Yeah.
And he said, I can't, you know. And then what happened is he joined the march.
Yeah.
And soon after the war, they only found corpses in the hospital.
Yeah.
You left to guess, but can you imagine? Haunted him for the rest of his life. I remember reading something from him, actually, in one of his diaries, or a reference to it. And he said, he basically asked for forgiveness from the chief rabbi in Jerusalem. It's reported that the chief rabbi just shook his head and said,
I'm not.
No, nothing to regret here.
Mm-hmm.
I haunted him for the rest of his life. And, remarkable. I should, I've told you quite a bit about, things as they affected the ghetto. The Rogauskas family were remarkable. He was a teacher, little schoolhouse, and that's where Ruth was hidden. And that's where the name comes from, Ruta's Closet, because she came out with this incredibly Jewish accent of the time. Mm-hmm. And they said, we've just got to get rid of this, So she was being taught Lithuanian, how to speak Lithuanian. And anytime there was a knock on the door, she'd run into his closet and hid.
Right.
And then other times, if there was a guest come over, she'd hide upstairs. And every time she dropped something or did something, Ono would say, "Oh, it's mice."
Right.
But then one day, a woman came around with her little daughter. And little daughter ran off upstairs and pulled up the bed sheet and looked, and there was little Ruth.
Oh yeah, right.
And she ran down and said, Mother, there's a girl upstairs. No. And Anna said, to this day, I don't really know whether the mother figured it out or not, but it was never a problem. They were incredibly brave. When I interviewed Anna and said, why do you do this? And she said, it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
It was the right thing to do. Well, it turned out that they were hiding Jews in the barn at the back so that they would have this kind of underground railway, you might say. So they'd be there for 2 nights, and Ruth would come out and see them in all these eyes in the barn, because at some point she was playing out and she'd see all these eyes behind through the slats and it was just the right thing to do. What's truly remarkable is that she had lost her son, very young, Rymantis, to diphtheria. I think maybe 6 months before everything started to go bad.
Okay.
And she always said she'd save a child, and I don't know if you know this, but within a few months of Ruth being there, she contracted diphtheria.
Really?
Yeah. And so,
wow.
When the Nazis were invading, everybody else was running to the supermarket, or the equivalent thereof, to get food.
Yeah.
And he was picking up things like diphtheria serum and medications. So, sure enough, it was somebody else in the pipeline. A doctor came and delivered it and injected her, and she got well, obviously. But and this couple were a part of a loose network. Mm-hmm. Wisely, not everybody knew each other, right? And that was appropriate. Yeah. But there were, much as we've heard about the bad things that Catholic priests did in that area, there was a remarkable community of those who saved Jews. And there's this Father Kleiber, who anytime there was a threat or the risk of the Nazis doing searches, she would go and stay with him, and she'd go on his brother's bicycle, sit on the handlebars, and he'd drive them up to Father Kleiber's. The place was full of Jews, and it was that was amazing. Again, Kleiber died a long time ago, but I was fortunate enough. I managed to find some people in the church, still in the church there, who either remembered him or knew of him or what he'd done. So I was able to piece that together. So, a lot of brave people out there who wouldn't do what some of their neighbors were doing, that they were active participants in saving Jews. But Anna, how can I describe it? She was such a sweet grandma type. Like, you would not ever imagine her doing what she did. I mean, she's so sweet, she was sweet, but you know what I'm saying? She wasn't rough around the edges or anything. She was her Christian duty to do that.
Wow.
And one of the other things that struck me, she had to introduce her to other people. Once she got comfortable, Ruth, that she had to be introduced. So she was introduced, I think, as a niece from somewhere else. And they staged this arrival on the back of a truck.
Wow.
And horse-drawn, of course. And she arrived to great, that kind of stuff. And that's how, so she had to go to church. And that's when Ruth developed this lifelong fascination with the Catholic Church. And, she would sit in the Mass. And I guess in one of them, they were doing the Tridentine Latin Mass. She kind of looked and said, what's he saying? Type of thing, We don't know either. But, it was wonderful. And she talked about that often, about her love of the churches. And, that never left her. And, of course, Jewish children who were saved, some rescuers basically wanted to keep them, right? They did not. They wanted to turn them into Christians. And interesting little debates, which I got from Anna, how she felt so badly. She wouldn't do that. And she talked to Antanas, her husband, and said, we've just got to look after her and save her and then return her to her parents. And he agreed. And the conscience thing, we mustn't allow her to, stray from the love of her parents. And in fact, when the Russians liberated, it took Maya and Gita to make a number of visits before Ruth was comfortable in going with them. Because being with Jews, speaking Yiddish, meant death. Right?
Right. Yeah.
And it took a while. Wow. And she said, she picked up a few Catholic things, she had beads and that. And she said, I'll come back. Now, this from Ruth. I'll come back. But I keep this and that and that. And if I want to go to church, I go to church. And bless them, marrying me to wisdom, and said, okay.
Did your grandma, your bubby, did she speak pretty good English?
Mine, right? Just clarifying. She spoke fluent English in terms of when I was born and when I was in my lifetime, yes. But of course, I think she didn't come to Canada really knowing a lot of English. And if she did, it wouldn't have been as profound and refined as it would have been when I was growing up and time that I knew her. She would have passed away when I was only in 12th grade, 11th or 12th grade, right? So what I found really interesting, Keith, is that when I met you, and again, because I had heard that you were working on her story and her memoirs and things, and met you in person and having the book handed, and it was just really powerful. One thing I'm really curious about, because I can't believe we're almost at the end of our hour here together. I'm really curious to know about, in the later parts of my grandmother's life and your communication with her and everything, did you notice any shifts in her nature, in her personality, in her ways of thought or speech, in her transition from being re-diagnosed with cancer, metastasized cancer, through the later parts of that year? Did you notice any differences in your relationship with her?
No, she didn't change. I'm sure obviously family would notice, but no, she was remarkable. I would never, she told me the first time, what had happened. And then she broke it to me, but it was done in a way that oh, if you'd re-diagnose this has happened, who knows? So when are you going to finish the book?
Yeah.
That was what she was like.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
the day she died, I cried because I got the final manuscript that she'd approved to her.
Oh.
But it wasn't the final.
Yeah, yeah.
And I cried because I wanted it to be published before she died.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't happening. I mean, it wasn't finished. And it was, at least, again, technology was at a time when publishing was really difficult. I had a good agent, but because they were moving into digital ebooks, all publishing houses were putting in their money into turning their established authors' roster of books into ebooks. And I'd get things back from my agent who said, I'm going to name the publishers, reputable publishers, who said, we're really interested in 2 years. And I said, what are we going to do? Anyway, the Holocaust Center came to me and said, could you find a way of publishing 1,000, 2,000 books? Mm-hmm. And what we'll do is we'll send them out to 2,000 people as a fundraiser. So the agent said to me, that won't harm it at all. It's a great idea. So I went, I knew another friend called Lorne Sigal, who I'd worked with on the Coast Mental Health Foundation's Courage to Come Back Awards. I wrote the original stories, and I brought Lorne to tears many a lunchtime with stories from the book.
Right.
Thought, here's the man who can fund this, this venture, because it's not cheap to do that. Anyway, I went to Lorne, and he looked at the mock-up back cover. He said, "That's Ruta Kron." I said, "I know. That's Ruth's mother. She taught me Hebrew," he said.
No.
Yeah. My great grandmother taught a lot of Vancouverites Hebrew and Talmud Torah.
So he went to his buddies, his classmates, and said, "Hey, we got to fund this," and they did.
Amazing!
And,
wow.
And that's what happened. And then we don't have time today, but then there was a publisher in the UK who came after it too, and did that. And now we're podcasting, or we will be next year. It'll be next spring before the podcast is out, but it's going to be very forward, educational. There's going to be a high school element to it. There's going to be a book club element, and then follow-up features like the ones I've just told you about. So It's an exciting time.
Wait to listen to it. And, I have to say, Keith, you've inspired me. I have my Zadie, because it's very interesting. It's kind of profound to hear the differences between when a child like Ruth, child survivor of the Holocaust, and then like I said, my grandparents, who were probably a decade at least older than she was throughout the Holocaust, and just the differences in certain stories and things like that. My point is, my grandfather is on video with Steven Spielberg's people that went to North America. I think it was the Shoah Foundation.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And so, but it's all in Yiddish. And so you've just kind of lit the fire in me again to get it all, translated, my brain translated. So thank you for that, because again, these stories that I don't know if it's just been, I love my father. I don't know if it's just been laziness on his part, but as the grandchild, I'll take it upon myself to let this story be heard. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to echo Rachel, I really do appreciate you being here and all the work you've done to fulfill my grandmother's story and the other people that are in her generation that their stories need to be fully facilitated and told as well. I always considered myself my grandmother's grandson. When I look at the relationship that I had with my grandmother, basically it was always fighting. That was basically my outlet for anger and rage. And same for that. We butted heads nonstop. And so when I look at my relationship with my grandmother now, looking back, I do wish that I got to spend more time with her. And she offered that ability to spend more time. But all I could think is we're just gonna end up fighting. why should I be around a person, right, where I'm going to be fighting all the time? Because that's coming from a kid's mindset of like, I just let me be in peace, right? But I give it to my grandmother because she lived so fiercely within me that I kind of look at my parents, and I obviously have my mother and my father in me. But it's interesting. I always say to people, I'm my grandmother's grandson first. I feel like I skipped a generation. And a lot of those natures, personalities, and that kind of drive to persevere is something that you can't take away from anybody. And me and Rachel are part of that too. Like, we're part of that generation of Holocaust survivors that have been through so much adversity that we somehow have it in here, that unquestionable drive to be successful or to prove that we are worthy. And it's pretty amazing how our ancestry has done that for us and other backgrounds too, but we're talking about this specific angle of that. So thank you for capturing those stories of those people, and for
those are just some of the stories. There's many more, you know. I've given you a stories.
There's tons of stories, you know, but I really am grateful that you could share what you have shared, and that you are staying the course to share that part of my ancestry that I still don't know much about. But I'm so grateful that someone is able to share it. So thank you very much.
It's all a great ploy to get you to read the book.
Yeah, it is definitely a great ploy for sure, and it will definitely happen. For
Just
sure.
teasing, don't worry.
Totally. No, thank you very much. Is there anything else that you want to share? Or
no, I guess I just to say that watch out for the podcast.
Okay.
I need to do some travel to do some interviews. We're looking for sponsors, obviously, because it's costly. And I'm hoping to get moving on that soon. There's lots of foundations out there. One thing I would just quickly add is one of the things I'm hoping to do in tying in with the high school element within the podcast. I'm prepared to give away 20 copies with the Vancouver Holocaust Centre's wonderful guide for teachers to the book, to any school in North America, to use it as part of their Holocaust studies.
Wow.
So I'll be talking more about it at a time, but that's going to be part of this. So lots to do.
Amazing. And currently, where are you located, Keith?
Within Vancouver. I'm just working from home.
Okay, amazing.
Wish I was on the road, but we've all been, kind of stopped on doing that right now.
Absolutely. Okay, well, please keep in touch. If there's anything that myself or Rachel can further to do and support what's happening, please let us know, and we will have everything in the show notes and have your episode, this conversation, published within the next 7 to 10 days.
Okay, let me know. Thanks very much for the opportunity. Ruth would be proud of you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That means a lot. I take that to heart.
Okay.
All right. Bye for now. Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.